Ruth's frozen fingers couldn't grip the rusted metal handle anymore. The cabin door, 15 feet away, might as well have been a mile. Wind screamed through the Nebraska darkness, stealing what little warmth her body still held. She'd been out here 3 minutes, maybe 4. Her lips had stopped working 30 seconds ago. The barn animals would have to wait. She wasn't going to make it back inside. 17 years old, widowed 2 months, and this godforsaken homestead was going to kill her the same way it killed Elias. She tried to scream for help, but there was nobody within 10 miles to hear her die. Before we continue Ruth's story, please subscribe to our channel and follow this journey to the very end. Comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's discover what Ruth found that changed everything. The neighbors had told Ruth that Elias Mercer died crazy. She believed them for exactly 6 days, the length of time it took her to move her 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, and the wooden box containing her marriage certificate into the cabin that was now, inexplicably, hers. "You can't be serious about staying out there," Mrs. Calloway had cornered her outside the land office in Valentine, Nebraska, her face pinched with what might have been concern or might have been disgust. "That place killed your husband, child. It'll kill you too." Ruth had signed the papers anyway. She had nowhere else to go. The cabin sat on 160 acres of rolling sandhills, 23 miles from town. The locals called it Mercer's Winter Grave, though Elias had only owned it for 2 years before he died. The name stuck because of what happened last February, when Sheriff Morrison found Elias frozen solid, 50 feet from his own front door. One arm stretched toward the barn, like he'd been reaching for something he'd never quite touched. "Exposure," the sheriff had said. "Man went out to feed his animals and got turned around in the storm. Happens every winter out here." But Ruth knew that wasn't the whole truth. She'd seen it in the way the sheriff's eyes had shifted when he handed her the death certificate. She'd heard it in the silence that followed whenever someone mentioned Elias's name. The first night in the cabin, Ruth understood why they called her husband crazy. The interior was a maze of incomprehensible modifications. Shelves had been torn out and replaced with hooks that held nothing. The floor had been partially excavated in the northeast corner, revealing a shallow pit that served no obvious purpose. Most bizarre of all were the notebooks, 17 of them, stacked on the table in chronological order, each one filled with Elias's cramped handwriting. Ruth opened the first one. October 12, 1867. Wind speed, 23 miles per hour from northwest. Temperature at dawn, 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature at midday, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Distance from cabin to barn, 50 feet. Time required to traverse in calm weather, 12 seconds. Time required in 20 miles per hour wind, 47 seconds. Note: must account for disorientation factor. Page after page of measurements, wind speeds, temperatures, calculations about heat loss and exposure times, diagrams of wind patterns around the buildings. "He measured everything," Ruth whispered to the empty room. "Like he was preparing for war." The later notebooks grew increasingly desperate. The handwriting became harder to read, the measurements more frantic. By the final notebook, dated January 1868, 1 month before Elias died, the entries had transformed into something that looked like madness. The gap between safety and death is 50 feet. In a blizzard, it might as well be 50 miles. Wind doesn't just steal heat, it steals direction, steals thought, steals the will to keep moving. I've timed it. I've measured it. In a whiteout, a man has 4 minutes before his fingers stop working. Maybe 5 if he's lucky. The animals need feeding twice daily. Every trip is a calculated risk. Every trip might be the last one. There has to be a solution. There has to be. Ruth closed the notebook and looked around the cabin with new eyes. The strange modifications weren't random. They were experiments. Elias had been trying to solve a problem that had ultimately killed him. She went to bed that night with the wind howling outside, wondering what solution her husband had been searching for. She woke up freezing. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight. Ruth's breath came out in white clouds. The single blanket she'd brought provided almost no warmth. She pulled on every piece of clothing she owned and went to inspect the stove. Empty. Completely empty. No. She checked the woodpile outside, or where the woodpile should have been. There was nothing, just bare ground and dead grass poking through early snow. No, no, no. Ruth searched the barn. No wood. She searched the small storage shed. No wood. She made a complete circuit of the property, growing more desperate with each empty location. Elias had left her a 160-acre homestead with no fuel to heat it. "What were you thinking?" Ruth demanded of the empty air, anger replacing her initial panic. "What kind of man leaves his widow to freeze?" The kind who died measuring wind speeds, apparently. Ruth forced herself to think. She had maybe $2 in coins. The nearest neighbor was 6 miles away, a family named Patterson, who'd made it clear they wanted nothing to do with Mercer's cursed property. Town was 23 miles, and she had no horse, no wagon, nothing to get her there. She could burn the furniture. That would buy her maybe 3 days. Then what? The answer came from the most unlikely source. Ruth was searching through Elias's notebooks again, looking for anything useful, when she found a loose page tucked into the back of the final volume. It was a sketch, crude but detailed, showing the cabin and barn connected by what looked like a tunnel or covered passage. Notes in the margins read, "Straw bales, cheap, available. Earth insulation, wind protection, maintain temperature differential. Access during storms." Below the sketch, in larger letters, "It's the only way." Ruth stared at the drawing for a long time. A tunnel. Elias had wanted to build a tunnel between the cabin and the barn. "You were going to protect yourself from the wind," Ruth said slowly. "You knew the 50 feet was what would kill you, so you were going to eliminate it. But he died before he could build it." Ruth looked out the window at the barn. 50 feet of open ground. In calm weather, it was nothing. But when the storms came, and they would come, probably within days based on the gray sky, that 50 feet would become impassable. She'd be trapped in the cabin with no food, while the animals starved in the barn, or she'd risk the crossing and end up like Elias, frozen in the snow. Unless she built the tunnel. "I don't know how to build anything," Ruth said to the empty cabin. But even as she spoke, she was pulling on her coat. "I don't know the first thing about construction or straw bales or any of this." She grabbed the notebook with Elias's sketch and headed for the barn. The barn contained 3 milk cows, a half-dozen chickens, and approximately 300 bales of straw. Ruth stood in the doorway, doing rough calculations. If she used the straw to build walls, she'd have no bedding for the animals. But if she didn't build the tunnel, the animals would starve anyway, because she wouldn't be able to feed them during storms. "Some choice," she muttered. But was it really a choice, or was it simply the only option? Ruth started hauling straw bales. She worked through the afternoon, stacking bales in a rough line between the cabin and barn. The work was harder than anything she'd ever done. Each bale weighed at least 50 pounds, and her arms burned after the first dozen. By the time the sun started setting, she'd managed to create a wall maybe 10 feet long, 1/5 of the total distance. Her hands were bleeding. Her back screamed, and she'd barely made a dent in what needed to be done. "This is impossible," Ruth said, sitting down hard on one of the bales. "I can't do this alone." But there was nobody to help her. The Pattersons wouldn't come. The town thought she was foolish for staying, and asking for help would mean admitting she couldn't survive on her own, which would make it easier for someone to claim the property was abandoned and take it from her. Ruth pulled out Elias's notebook and studied the sketch again. Her husband had drawn support structures, measurements for the width of the passage, notes about how to pack earth around the base for insulation. "You figured all this out," Ruth said to the page. "You knew exactly what needed to be done. You just ran out of time." She traced her finger along the tunnel design. "So, I'll finish what you started." The next 3 days were brutal. Ruth worked from dawn until she couldn't see anymore, hauling straw bales and stacking them according to Elias's design. She created walls on both sides of the passage, leaving a gap of about 3 feet between them, just wide enough for her to walk through. She used additional bales to create a roof, overlapping them to shed water and snow. The work destroyed her hands. Blisters formed, broke, and bled. Her shoulders felt like they were on fire. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, surviving on chicken eggs and what little flour she had left. But the tunnel grew. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. On the 4th day, Mrs. Patterson appeared. Ruth was dragging another straw bale when she heard the voice behind her. "Heard you were building something out here." Ruth turned to find Sarah Patterson sitting on a horse, looking at the half-finished tunnel with an expression Ruth couldn't quite read. "News travels fast," Ruth said carefully. "Tom Morrison was out checking fence lines. Said he saw you hauling straw. Said it looked like you were going crazy like your husband did." Sarah climbed down from the horse. "I told him he was probably right, but I figured I'd come see for myself." Ruth braced herself for mockery. Instead, Sarah walked the length of the tunnel, examining the construction. "What's it for?" Sarah asked finally. "Protection from the wind," Ruth said, "so I can reach the barn during storms." "That's what killed Elias, isn't it? The walk between buildings." Ruth nodded. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You need help?" Ruth's throat tightened. "I can manage." "That wasn't the question." Sarah rolled up her sleeves. "You need help or not?" "Yes," Ruth whispered. "Yes, I need help." Sarah worked alongside her until sunset. They didn't talk much. Sarah wasn't the talking type. But they fell into an easy rhythm. Sarah was stronger, able to lift the heavy bales more easily. Ruth focused on placement and alignment, making sure everything matched Elias's specifications. When Sarah finally left, the tunnel stretched 40 feet. "I'll be back tomorrow," Sarah said, climbing onto her horse. "And I'll bring Tom. He owes me for fixing his wagon wheel." "Why are you helping me?" Ruth asked. Sarah looked at her for a long moment. "Because everyone said you wouldn't last a week out here. I figured you'd either prove them right or prove them wrong. And I always bet on the underdog." She rode off into the gathering darkness. Tom Patterson came the next day, grudgingly. He complained about the work, questioned the design, and generally made his opinion clear that Ruth was wasting everyone's time. "This won't work," he said, examining the straw walls. "First good snow will knock it down. Then where will you be?" "Same place I'd be without it," Ruth replied. "But at least I'll have tried." Tom grunted and kept working. They finished the tunnel on the 6th day. It wasn't beautiful. The walls were uneven in places, and the roof had gaps that would need additional patching. But it was functional. Ruth could now walk from the cabin to the barn, completely protected from the wind. "Well," Tom said, standing back to survey their work, "I'll be damned. It actually looks like it might hold." "It'll hold," Ruth said, with more confidence than she felt. "It has to." That night, alone in the cabin, Ruth opened Elias's final notebook again. She'd been avoiding the last few entries, the ones written closest to his death. But now, with the tunnel complete, she felt ready to read them. January 28th, 1868. The design is complete. I know exactly what needs to be done, but I'm running out of time. The weather is turning, and I don't have enough straw bales positioned yet. If the storm comes before I finish, I'll have to risk the crossing. Just one more trip, maybe two. I can make it. The entry ended there. Ruth turned the page. January 30th, 1868. Storm coming. I can feel it in the air. The animals need feeding. The tunnel isn't finished. I'm still 20 feet short. But they can't go without food. I have to try. It's only 50 feet. I've made the crossing 100 times. I can do it again. I can do it again. I can do it again. The same phrase written over and over, filling the rest of the page. Ruth closed the notebook, her hands shaking. Elias had known. He'd understood the danger, calculated the risks, designed the solution. But he'd run out of time, and the gap he couldn't close had killed him. I finished it, Ruth whispered to the empty room. I finished what you started. A small victory. But the winter was just beginning, and Ruth had no wood, almost no food, and no way to know if her tunnel would actually work when the real storms came. She was about to find out. The first true blizzard hit 3 days later. Ruth woke to a world transformed. Snow fell so thickly she couldn't see the barn from the cabin window. The wind howled with a sound that seemed almost alive, battering against the walls with enough force to make the entire structure shake. This was what had killed Elias, this exact storm, or one like it. Ruth pulled on every layer she owned and stepped into the tunnel. The difference was immediate. Inside the straw walls, the wind's roar became muted. The temperature was still freezing, but without the wind stealing heat from her body, it was survivable. Ruth walked the 50 feet to the barn in less than a minute, completely protected. The animals were agitated, but alive. Ruth fed them, talking softly to calm both them and herself. "We're going to make it," she said, stroking one of the cows' necks. "Elias figured it out, and I built it, and we're going to make it." She was halfway back to the cabin when she heard the cracking sound. Ruth froze. The noise came from above, from the tunnel's roof. The accumulated snow was too heavy. One of the support bales was giving way. "No, no, no," Ruth breathed, looking up at the straw overhead. "Please hold. Please." The cracking grew louder. Ruth ran. She made it 5 steps before the roof section collapsed, dumping several 100 pounds of snow and straw directly onto her. The world went dark and cold and silent. Ruth couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The weight pressed down on her chest, forcing what little air she had out of her lungs. She tried to push upward, but her arms were pinned. "This is how I die," she thought with strange clarity. Not from exposure, like Elias. From my own tunnel, collapsing on top of me. She was going to suffocate in the very structure meant to save her life. Unless... Ruth twisted her right hand, the only part of her body with any mobility. Her fingers found a gap in the straw, a small space where the bales hadn't completely compressed. She pulled, creating a slightly larger opening. Then another, and another. It took everything she had. Her lungs burned. Black spots danced in her vision. But slowly, agonizingly, Ruth created enough space to draw a breath. Then another. Then she started digging. It took 20 minutes to free herself. 20 minutes of blind panic and desperate clawing at straw and snow. When Ruth finally pulled herself out of the collapsed section, she lay on the tunnel floor, gasping and shaking. The tunnel was destroyed. At least 15 feet of roof had come down, leaving the passage exposed to the storm. Wind and snow poured through the gap, quickly filling the space she'd just escaped from. Ruth crawled toward the cabin, every muscle screaming. She made it inside and collapsed in front of the cold stove, too exhausted to even cry. The tunnel had failed. Elias's design and her execution of it hadn't been strong enough, which meant she was back where she started, trapped in a cabin with no heat, no food, and no way to reach the barn once the current storm ended and the next one began. Ruth closed her eyes, willing herself to think. There had to be something she was missing, some piece of the puzzle she hadn't found yet. Then she remembered the pit, the strange excavation in the northeast corner of the cabin, the modification that had made no sense when she first saw it. Ruth crawled over to examine it more closely. The pit was about 3 feet deep and roughly square. The dirt at the bottom looked disturbed, like it had been dug recently and then partially refilled. Ruth started digging. Her hands were already raw and bleeding. She didn't care. She dug with a desperation born of knowing this was her last chance. 6 inches down, her fingers hit wood. Ruth's heart started hammering. She dug faster, clearing dirt away until she could see what Elias had hidden. A trap door, leading to a space beneath the cabin floor. Ruth pulled the door open and looked down into darkness. She couldn't see what was down there, but she could smell it. Wood smoke, dried meat, lamp oil. A survival cache. Elias had built a survival cache. Ruth scrambled to find her lantern, hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice. She lit the wick and lowered it into the pit. The space below was small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, but it was packed with supplies. Cordwood stacked neatly against one wall, smoked ham and dried beans in sealed containers, candles, blankets, a small potbelly stove complete with chimney pipe that must have vented somewhere she hadn't noticed. Ruth started laughing, then crying, then both at once. Elias hadn't left her to freeze. He'd planned for this. The tunnel was Plan A, the ideal solution. But this cache was Plan B, the insurance against failure. Her husband hadn't died crazy. He'd died trying to protect a wife he'd barely known, preparing for a winter he wouldn't survive to see. Ruth hauled supplies up from the cache until her arms gave out. Wood for the stove, food for her belly, blankets for warmth. Everything she needed to survive until spring. But as she finally got the fire going and felt heat spread through the cabin for the first time in days, Ruth understood something else. The tunnel hadn't failed. Not completely. Yes, it had collapsed, but only because she'd built it wrong. The roof needed better support. The bales needed to be packed tighter. The design required modifications she could now see clearly. Elias had given her the foundation. The survival cache had given her time. Now Ruth would give the tunnel a second chance. The storm raged for 3 days. Ruth stayed inside, feeding the stove with Elias's hidden cordwood and eating from his cache of dried beans and smoked ham. Each time she added a log to the fire, she spoke to her dead husband. "You knew," she said on the second day, watching flames dance behind the stove door. "You knew exactly how long a widow could survive out here without help. You calculated it, didn't you? Just like you calculated everything else." The wind answered with a howl that rattled the windows. On the third day, Ruth pulled every notebook from the shelf and read them cover to cover. This time, she wasn't looking for survival instructions. She was looking for the man who'd left them. She found him in the margins. Between the temperature readings and wind speed calculations were small notes that had nothing to do with weather. Ruth arrives Tuesday. Must remember she likes her tea sweet. And later, asked Ruth about her family. She changed the subject. Don't push. And weeks before he died. Ruth barely speaks to me anymore. I don't blame her. What kind of man brings a 17-year-old bride to the middle of nowhere and then spends his days measuring wind? Ruth's hand shook as she read. She'd thought Elias hadn't cared about her, that their marriage was just a transaction, her father's debt paid in exchange for a wife Elias didn't particularly want. But these notes told a different story. She deserves better than this, better than me. But if something happens, when something happens, she'll need more than prayers to survive. The cache is almost ready. The tunnel design is perfected. If I can just finish before the next storm, maybe I can give her one thing worth having. A chance. You died trying to protect me, Ruth whispered, and I didn't even know. The storm broke on the fourth morning. Ruth stepped outside into a world buried in snow. Drifts reached halfway up the cabin walls. The barn was completely invisible behind white mountains, and the tunnel, what remained of it, was destroyed beyond recognition. But Ruth wasn't the same person who'd built that first tunnel. She had supplies now, time, and most importantly, she understood what Elias had been trying to teach her. Survival wasn't about strength. It was about preparation. She started digging. The work was even harder than before. The snow was heavy and wet, and every shovelful seemed to be replaced by two more sliding down from the drifts. Ruth's back screamed. Her hands, barely healed from building the first tunnel, cracked open again. She worked until she couldn't lift the shovel anymore. Then she went inside, ate, slept for 4 hours, and came back out to dig some more. On the second day, Sarah Patterson appeared through the snow on horseback, leading a second horse behind her. "Figured you'd be dead," Sarah called out. "Came to collect the body." "Not dead yet," Ruth called back, leaning on her shovel. Sarah dismounted and walked over to inspect Ruth's progress. "You're rebuilding it. Better this time. Tom said you were crazy. Said the whole thing collapsed and nearly killed you." "It did collapse. It did nearly kill me. That's why I'm making it stronger." Sarah studied her for a long moment. "You planning to do this alone?" "I've got time now. Found Elias's winter supplies." "That's not what I asked." Ruth met her eyes. "I don't want to owe anyone." "Too late." Sarah grabbed the extra shovel from Ruth's pile of tools. "You already owe me for last time. Might as well owe me more." They worked in silence for an hour before Sarah spoke again. "Tom thinks you're going to get someone killed with this tunnel obsession of yours. Says you should sell the property and move back to civilization." "What do you think?" Ruth asked. "I think Tom talks too much." Sarah threw another shovelful of snow aside. "But I also think he's got a point. This land is hard. The winters are harder. And you're out here alone with nothing but your dead husband's notebooks." "I'm not leaving." "Didn't say you should. Just said Tom had a point." Sarah paused in her work. "But here's another point. Every man who settled this valley thought he could outsmart the weather. Most of them are dead now. The ones who survived learned to respect what they couldn't control." "Elias tried to respect it. The weather killed him anyway." "No," Sarah said quietly. "Pride killed him. He knew the storm was coming. He knew the tunnel wasn't finished. He went out anyway, because admitting he wasn't ready would have meant admitting he'd failed." The words hit Ruth harder than the cold wind. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because Tom found him." Sarah drove her shovel into the snow and left it there. "Sheriff Morrison wrote exposure on the death certificate. But Tom was the one who rode out here when Elias didn't show up in town for supplies. Tom found him frozen, 50 feet from the barn, with an empty feed bucket in his hand. Ruth's throat tightened. I didn't know Tom found him. Tom doesn't talk about it. Says it's not proper to speak ill of the dead. But he told me Elias's tracks in the snow went back and forth between the cabin and barn 3 times that day. 3 trips. The man knew he was dying by the 3rd trip. His tracks were wandering, confused. But he made the trip anyway, because the animals needed feeding. He was trying to finish, Ruth said, before he ran out of time. He ran out of time the day he decided to homestead out here without a partner strong enough to survive alone. Sarah pulled her shovel free and went back to work. Don't make the same mistake. You want to build this tunnel? Fine, build it. But build it smart. Build it with help. Build it so that if something happens to you, someone else knows how it works. That night, Ruth wrote her first entry in a new notebook. February 7th, 1868. Temperature at dawn, 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow depth, 37 inches. Current tunnel status, destroyed. Lesson learned. Roof support requires double-layered bales with offset joints. Single layer cannot handle snow load. Sarah Patterson helped clear snow today. She's right about needing help. Elias knew everything about surviving the weather, but nothing about surviving alone. I won't make that mistake. She wrote 3 more pages of observations and modifications before her hands cramped too badly to continue. The next morning, Tom Patterson showed up with 4 neighbors Ruth had never met. Sarah says you're rebuilding, Tom announced without preamble. Says you're doing it wrong again. So we're here to do it right. Ruth bristled. I know what I'm doing. Do you? Tom gestured at the destroyed tunnel. Because from where I'm standing, you're 1 storm away from being a frozen corpse like your husband. Tom, Sarah said warningly. No, she needs to hear this. Tom turned back to Ruth. You want to stay out here? Fine. But if you die, that's on you. If one of us gets hurt helping you with some fool project, that's on you too. So either you listen to people who've actually survived more than 1 winter in the sandhills, or you do this alone. Your choice. The anger that flared in Ruth's chest was hot and immediate, but underneath it was something else. Fear. Because Tom was right. She didn't know what she was doing. She was 17 years old, playing at survival, with her dead husband's notes. And sooner or later, that was going to get someone killed. What would you do differently? She asked. Tom's eyebrows rose. He'd clearly expected a fight. Well, first thing, we're going to dig down before we build up. Create a trench. That way the walls are supported by earth on both sides, not just stacked bales that'll blow over in the wind. Elias's notes didn't mention trenches. Your husband was a smart man, but he was also trying to do everything himself. Tom pulled out a piece of paper with a rough sketch. This is how we build winter passages. Done it a dozen times. Costs more labor up front, but it doesn't collapse. Ruth studied the drawing. It was similar to Elias's design, but more robust. The trench idea made immediate sense. Earth didn't blow away in storms. How deep? She asked. 3 feet. 4 if you want to be safe. That's a lot of digging. That's why I brought help. Tom gestured at the 4 men behind him. This is James Holloway, Peter Chen, Marcus Webb, and Daniel Foster. They've all built winter passages before. They're here because I told them you were Sarah's project, and nobody wants to argue with Sarah. That's not why we're here, James Holloway said. He was older than the others, maybe 50, with a weathered face and kind eyes. We're here because we remember what it's like to be new to this land, and because your husband once helped Marcus find his stray cattle during a storm. He never asked for payment. Said, Neighbors help neighbors. Ruth looked at Marcus Webb, who nodded. Elias tracked my cows for 6 miles in freezing rain, brought them back personally, refused dinner as thanks because he said Ruth, you, were waiting for him at home. The tightness in Ruth's throat made it hard to speak. I didn't know that. He didn't talk about himself much, Marcus said, but he was a good man. Little strange with all his measuring and calculating, but good. So, Tom said, breaking the emotional moment with characteristic bluntness, are we building this tunnel or standing around sharing memories? They started digging. 7 people working together made the impossible merely difficult. By sunset, they'd excavated a trench 3 feet deep and 20 feet long. By the end of the second day, the trench reached the barn. Ruth worked alongside them, insisting on doing her share, despite protests from James that she should rest. It's my tunnel, she said, throwing another shovelful of earth onto the growing pile. I need to know how it's built. Smart girl, Peter Chen said approvingly. He was the quietest of the group, speaking only when he had something worth saying. Too many people want the result without understanding the process. Your husband was the same way, always asking questions, always wanting to know the why behind the how. Did you know him well? Ruth asked. Well enough. He came to me last fall asking about root cellar construction. Wanted to know how deep to dig to stay above the frost line but below the heat line. I told him 4 feet. He dug 6 just to be safe. Peter smiled at the memory. That's how he was, always adding a margin of safety to everything. Except his own survival, Ruth said quietly. Peter's smile faded. He knew he was taking a risk that last day. I saw him in town 2 days before the storm hit. He was buying extra feed for the animals, talking about how the weather was turning. I asked if he was ready, and he said, Peter paused, choosing his words carefully. He said he was as ready as he'd ever be, that sometimes you just have to trust your preparations and hope they're enough. They weren't enough. No, Peter agreed. But maybe they are now, because you're here, finishing what he started. That night, Ruth went back to Elias's notebooks with new understanding. She'd been reading them as survival manuals. Now she read them as love letters. Every measurement, every calculation, every obsessive detail was Elias trying to protect a wife he barely knew, but desperately wanted to save. He'd measured wind speeds because he wanted to know exactly how dangerous the gap between cabin and barn was. He'd calculated heat loss because he wanted to know how long Ruth could survive if the fire went out. He'd designed the tunnel because he wanted to give her a way to stay safe when he couldn't protect her himself. And he'd built the cache as insurance. As a final gift from a man who knew he might not survive to see spring. Ruth cried for the first time since Elias died. Not gentle tears, but wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for the husband she'd never really known, for the conversations they'd never had, for the life they might have built together if he'd just asked for help instead of trying to solve everything alone. When the tears finally stopped, Ruth made herself a promise. She would finish the tunnel. She would survive the winter. And she would make sure Elias's methods, his careful preparations and calculated safety margins, were shared with everyone in the valley. His death would mean something. It had to. The tunnel was completed in 9 days. The final structure looked nothing like Ruth's first attempt. The trench provided natural insulation and wind protection. The walls were double-layered straw bales with offset joints, exactly as Ruth had written in her notebook. The roof was a complex framework of wooden supports covered with layers of straw, then earth, then more straw, creating a structure that could hold several feet of snow without collapsing. "It's beautiful," Ruth said, walking the length of the completed tunnel for the first time. "It's functional," Tom corrected, but he was smiling. "Let's see how it holds up when the next storm hits." They didn't have to wait long. The second blizzard came 5 days later, hitting with even more force than the first. Ruth woke to the familiar howl of wind and the rattle of snow against windows. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She pulled on her coat and walked into the tunnel. The difference was extraordinary. Inside the protected passage, the storm was reduced to a distant roar. The temperature was still well below freezing, but without the wind, it was bearable. Ruth made the walk to the barn in complete safety, fed the animals, and returned to the cabin without even breathing hard. Tom had been right. The tunnel worked. But the real test came 3 weeks later, when Ruth heard pounding on her door at midnight. She opened it to find James Holloway, half frozen, barely able to stand. "My grandson," James gasped. "Fever. Can't break it. Wife sent me for help, but I got turned around in the dark and the storm. I don't know where I am." Ruth pulled him inside and got him by the fire. "You're at the Mercer homestead. How far is your place?" 4 miles northwest, maybe 5. Hard to tell in the dark." 5 miles in a blizzard. Impossible. By the time Ruth could get help from town, James's grandson might be dead. Unless... "The cache," Ruth said suddenly. "Elias's cache." She ran to the excavated pit and climbed down with her lantern. Elias had left food, wood, blankets. But he'd also left something else. Ruth had seen it weeks ago, but hadn't understood its purpose until now. Medicine. Bottles of it, carefully labeled in Elias's handwriting. Willow bark for fever, peppermint for digestion, chamomile for sleep, and something else, a bottle labeled emergency fever treatment with detailed instructions. Ruth grabbed the bottle and climbed back up. "How old is your grandson?" 6 years. Ruth read the dosage instructions Elias had written. "This might help. I don't know for sure, I'm not a doctor. But Elias left detailed notes about when to use it." James took the bottle with shaking hands. "How do I get back home?" "You don't. Not in this storm. You'll stay here until it passes. Then I'll ride with you." Ruth helped him to a chair. "In the meantime, we wait." The storm lasted 18 hours. James spent most of it pacing, desperate to get back to his grandson, but knowing Ruth was right about the impossibility of travel. When the wind finally died down enough to risk the journey, they saddled James's horse and Ruth's borrowed one from Sarah. The ride to the Holloway homestead took 3 hours through snowdrifts. When they arrived, James's wife Emma opened the door with red eyes. "He's still alive," she said. "Barely." They gave the boy Elias's medicine, following his instructions precisely. 1 spoonful every 4 hours. Keep him warm. Keep him hydrated. By evening, the fever broke. By the next morning, he was asking for food. Emma Holloway clutched Ruth's hands with tears streaming down her face. "You saved him. You and your husband's medicine. You saved my grandson." "Elias saved him," Ruth said. "I just finished what he started." News of the miracle spread through the valley faster than the blizzards. Within a week, 3 families had visited Ruth asking about the survival cache and the medicine Elias had prepared. Within 2 weeks, Tom Patterson showed up asking for Elias's notebook on winter passage construction because 2 other homesteaders wanted to build their own tunnels. "They're calling it the Mercer method," Tom said, handing Ruth a list of questions from the neighbors. "Temperature calculations, safety margins, emergency preparations. People want to know how your husband thought about survival." Ruth looked at the list, her heart pounding. This was it. This was how Elias's death would mean something. "I'll teach them," she said. "Everything Elias wrote down, Everything I've learned building the tunnel. Everything in the cache. I'll share all of it." Tom nodded slowly. "People will listen now. Before, they thought Elias was crazy. But you proved his methods work. You proved they save lives." That night, Ruth started copying Elias's notebooks, translating his obsessive measurements into practical advice that any homesteader could follow. It was slow work. Her handwriting was nowhere near as neat as his, but she was determined to do it right. She was halfway through the second notebook when she found the letter. It was tucked into the very back of the final volume, behind all the weather data and survival notes. The paper was folded carefully, and on the outside was written a single word: Ruth. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. "Dear Ruth, if you're reading this, I'm dead. I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate, but it's true. I'm sorry for bringing you to this harsh land. I'm sorry for being a poor husband. I'm sorry for leaving you alone. But I'm not sorry for trying to protect you. Everything in this cabin, everything I've built and planned and hidden, is for you. The cache will keep you alive through the worst winter. The notebooks will teach you how to think about survival. The medicine will help when sickness comes. The tunnel, if I manage to finish it before the weather killed me, will keep you safe. I know you didn't love me. How could you? We barely knew each other. Your father sold you to pay his debts, and I bought you because I was lonely. Not exactly the foundation for a great romance. But I want you to know something. In the 6 months we were married, I grew to care for you more than I ever thought possible. Watching you try to make a home in this impossible place, watching you stay strong even when I could see you were terrified, watching you become the kind of woman who could survive anything. It made me want to be better, to do better. I failed at that. I know I did. I spent too much time measuring wind and not enough time talking to you. I prepared for every disaster except the one that mattered most, helping you feel like you belonged here. So here's what I want you to do if I'm gone. Don't try to survive alone. Ask for help. Share what I've learned. Let the neighbors see that my methods weren't madness. They were love disguised as calculations. And if you ever find someone who makes you happy, someone who can give you the life I couldn't, don't feel guilty. I want you to live, Ruth. Really live, not just survive. The land is hard, but you're harder. You're going to be fine. I wish I could have been there to see it. Yours, Elias. Ruth read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her own notebook, right next to her first entry about learning from Elias's mistakes. "I'm not alone anymore," she whispered. "And I am going to live. I promise." Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls. But inside, the fire burned warm, the cache was full, and Ruth Mercer was no longer afraid of winter. Spring came slowly to the Nebraska sandhills, and with it came people. The first wagon arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March. Ruth was outside, checking the tunnel's integrity after the winter thaw, when she heard wheels crunching through mud. A man she'd never seen before climbed down from the wagon seat. He was well dressed for a homesteader, wearing a suit coat that looked expensive, even covered in road dust. "Mrs. Mercer?" he called out. "That's right." "Name's Gerald Hutchins. I'm the land agent for Cherry County." He pulled papers from his coat. "I'm here to discuss the status of your claim." Ruth's stomach tightened. "What about it?" "Well, that's the question, isn't it?" Hutchins walked closer, his boots squelching in the mud. "Your husband filed this claim 2 years ago. The Homestead Act requires continuous residence and cultivation for 5 years before the land becomes yours. Now, with Mr. Mercer deceased, and you being, forgive me, A young woman alone. There's concern about whether you can meet those requirements. I've been living here all winter. So I've heard. I've also heard you've been giving away your late husband's supplies to neighbors, medicine specifically. Hutchins smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's very charitable, but it raises questions about your ability to sustain the property long term. Those supplies were meant to be shared. Were they? Or are you simply disposing of assets because you know you can't maintain the claim? Hutchins unfolded one of his papers. I have an offer from a gentleman named Vernon Pike. He's willing to purchase your improvements, the cabin, the barn, that interesting tunnel you've built, for $200. That's more than fair considering the property's condition. Ruth's hands clenched. The property isn't for sale. Mrs. Mercer, be reasonable. You're 17 years old. You have no family, no husband, no means of working this land properly. Mr. Pike is offering you a way out before you waste more time on an impossible situation. Who is Vernon Pike? A businessman from Omaha. He's been acquiring properties in the Sandhills for cattle ranching. Sees potential in the valley that individual homesteaders can't capitalize on alone. You mean he buys out people who are struggling? Hutchins' smile tightened. I mean he offers opportunities to those wise enough to take them. I'll leave these papers with you. Think it over. But understand, if you can't prove continuous cultivation by the time the land inspector comes through in June, you'll lose the property anyway. At least this way, you'll get something for your trouble. He climbed back into his wagon and left. Ruth stood in the mud, holding papers she had no intention of signing, feeling fury and fear war in her chest. Sarah Patterson arrived an hour later and found Ruth pacing in the cabin. Hutchins came to see you, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. How did you know? Because he visited 4 other properties in the valley this week. Same speech every time. Same offer from Vernon Pike. Same threat about the land inspector. Sarah sat down, uninvited. What did you tell him? I told him no. Good. Now here's what you need to know. Vernon Pike isn't just buying struggling homesteads. He's creating them. 3 families sold to him last month because mysterious things kept happening to their properties. Wells got contaminated. Fence lines got cut. Storage sheds caught fire. Ruth's blood went cold. You think Pike is sabotaging people? I think Pike wants this valley, and he's willing to do whatever it takes to get it. And I think you just became a problem for him. Because of Elias's methods. Because you're proving that individual homesteaders can survive here if they're smart about it. That undermines Pike's whole argument that the land is too harsh for small farmers. Sarah leaned forward. Ruth, you need to be careful. Pike doesn't like problems that can't be solved with money. That night, Ruth couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Hutchins's visit, about Vernon Pike's offers, about families driven off their land through sabotage. She was still awake when she smelled smoke. Ruth bolted upright. Smoke was coming from somewhere outside, thick enough that she could smell it through the cabin walls. She grabbed her coat and ran outside. The tunnel was on fire. Flames crawled along the straw roof, eating through the dried material with terrifying speed. Ruth ran for the water bucket, knowing even as she did that it was useless. 1 bucket against that inferno wouldn't make any difference. But she threw the water anyway, then ran back for another bucket, and another. She was on her 5th trip when Tom Patterson appeared on horseback, followed by Sarah and 3 other neighbors. "Get back!" Tom shouted. "The whole thing's going to collapse!" "I have to save it!" Ruth screamed. "I have to!" The tunnel's center section collapsed with a groan of breaking timber and falling earth. Flames shot higher, fed by fresh air. Ruth fell to her knees in the mud, watching months of work burn. Sarah dismounted and put a hand on Ruth's shoulder. "This wasn't an accident." "How do you know?" "Because fires don't start themselves in the middle of the night. And because I found this on my way here." Sarah held up a can. "Kerosene, tucked behind your woodpile." Tom took the can and examined it. His jaw was tight. "This is Pike's work. Has to be." "You can't prove that," one of the other neighbors said nervously. "Could have been anyone." "Who else benefits from Ruth losing her property?" Tom demanded. "Who else has been trying to buy up the valley?" "Pike owns half the businesses in Valentine," the nervous neighbor said. "You start accusing him of arson, you're going to make powerful enemies." "I don't care about powerful enemies," Tom said. "I care about stopping a man who's burning people out of their homes." Ruth barely heard them arguing. She was staring at the burning tunnel, at Elias's design going up in flames, at the proof of her survival turning to ash. Without the tunnel, she couldn't reach the barn safely during storms. Without the barn access, she couldn't keep animals through the winter. Without animals, she couldn't prove continuous cultivation. Without proving cultivation, she'd lose the property. Pike had just destroyed her ability to keep her land. "He wins," Ruth said quietly. "Pike wins." "No," Sarah's voice was hard. "He doesn't win. We rebuild." "With what? I can't afford more materials. I can't ask you all to give more time when someone's just going to burn it down again." "Then we build something that can't burn," Tom said. He was looking at the smoldering remains with an expression Ruth had never seen on his face before. Something cold and calculating. "We build it out of sod and earth. Let Pike try to burn dirt." The idea was audacious. Sod construction was back-breaking work, cutting blocks of earth and grass and stacking them like bricks. It would take weeks, maybe months, but it wouldn't burn. "I can't ask you to do that," Ruth said. "You're not asking," Sarah replied. "We're offering. Because if Pike can drive you out with fire, he can drive any of us out. This isn't just about your property anymore. It's about all of us." They started cutting sod the next morning. 12 families showed up to help. Even the nervous neighbor who'd warned about making enemies came, bringing his 2 grown sons and a wagon full of tools. They cut blocks of earth 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, 6 inches thick. Each block weighed more than 40 pounds. They stacked them in double rows, creating walls that were a foot thick and solid as stone. Ruth worked alongside them, her hands blistering and bleeding within the first hour. But she didn't stop. None of them did. On the 3rd day, Gerald Hutchins appeared again. "Mrs. Mercer," he called out, picking his way carefully through the construction site. "I heard about your unfortunate fire. Such a tragedy. This seems like an excellent time to reconsider Mr. Pike's offer." Ruth didn't even look up from the sod block she was positioning. "Tell Mr. Pike I'm not interested." "You're making a mistake. The land inspector will be here in 9 weeks. Do you really think you can rebuild in time?" "Yes." "And if there's another accident? Another fire, perhaps? Or maybe the well gets contaminated? These things happen in harsh country." Tom Patterson straightened up from his work, holding a cutting spade like a weapon. "Is that a threat, Hutchins?" "It's a statement of fact. Accidents happen." Hutchins smiled. "But they tend to happen less frequently to people who work with Mr. Pike instead of against him." "Get off this property," Ruth said, her voice low and dangerous. "Now." Hutchins's smile vanished. "You're making powerful enemies, Mrs. Mercer. You and everyone helping you. I hope you understand what that means." He left, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. That night, the neighbors gathered in Ruth's cabin to discuss what came next. "He's going to escalate," James Holloway said. "Fire didn't work, so he'll try something worse." "Let him try," Tom said. "We'll be ready." "Will we?" Emma Holloway looked worried. Pike has money, connections, probably men willing to do whatever he asks. What do we have? We have each other, Sarah said. And we have Elias's methods. Ruth, show them. Ruth pulled out the notebook she'd been copying. Elias didn't just prepare for weather. He prepared for everything. Look at this. She opened to a page titled Property Defense. Elias had drawn diagrams showing sightlines from the cabin, weak points in the property perimeter, places where intruders might approach unseen. He was planning for this, Marcus Webb said, studying the drawings. He knew someone might try to take the land. He knew the land was valuable, Ruth said, and he knew people with money and power don't like losing to people with neither. So he made plans. The plans were detailed and thorough. Guard rotations, signal systems, ways to protect the well from contamination. Everything organized with Elias's characteristic precision. He really did think of everything, Peter Chen said quietly. Not everything, Ruth replied. He didn't plan on dying before he could protect me himself. But he gave me the tools to protect myself. Now I'm going to use them. They implemented Elias's security plans that same night. 2 people on watch at all times. Signals between properties so neighbors could alert each other to trouble. Regular checks of the well water and food supplies. It felt like preparing for war. Maybe it was. The second attack came 5 days later, but they were ready. Daniel Foster was on watch when he saw riders approaching the property at 2 a.m. He lit the signal fire that alerted the other properties, then woke Ruth. 3 men, Daniel said, coming from the east, moving slow like they're trying to be quiet. Ruth grabbed Elias's rifle from above the door. She'd never fired it, but the weight was reassuring in her hands. By the time the riders reached the property, 8 neighbors had arrived, all armed. Tom stepped out to meet them. "You're on private property. Turn around." The lead rider, a man Ruth didn't recognize, pulled his horse to a stop. "We're here on behalf of Vernon Pike. He owns the grazing rights to this section." "No, he doesn't," Ruth called out. "I have the deed. This is homestead land." "The deed says Elias Mercer. Elias Mercer is dead. That makes the claim invalid." "The claim transfers to the surviving spouse. That's federal law." The rider smiled. "Federal law also says homesteaders have to prove continuous cultivation. Hard to cultivate land when your buildings keep burning down." "Is that another threat?" Sarah asked. "Because we're getting tired of threats." "It's a fact. Things burn. Wells get poisoned. Animals get loose. Accidents happen, especially to people too stubborn to accept fair offers." "Here's another fact," Tom said. He raised his rifle slightly, not quite pointing it, but making his meaning clear. "People who threaten their neighbors sometimes find that those neighbors aren't as helpless as they look. Now turn around and ride back to Pike. Tell him Ruth Mercer isn't going anywhere." The riders left, but everyone knew it wasn't over. Ruth spent the next week in a state of constant vigilance. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow might be an intruder. She slept in 2-hour shifts, never fully resting, always waiting for the next attack. The stress was taking its toll on everyone. Families were neglecting their own properties to guard Ruth's. Children were losing sleep. Tensions were rising. "This can't continue," Emma Holloway said during a meeting at the Patterson farm. "We're destroying ourselves trying to protect one claim." "It's not just one claim," Ruth insisted. "If Pike gets my land, he'll come for yours next." "Maybe. But maybe if you sold, he'd be satisfied. He'd leave the rest of us alone." The words stung, but Ruth understood. Emma was exhausted. They all were. "I won't sell," Ruth said quietly. "But I won't ask anyone to keep sacrificing for me either. If you need to stop helping, I understand." Emma looked away, shame and relief mixing on her face. James Holloway spoke up. "We don't stop. My grandson is alive because of Elias's medicine and Ruth's willingness to share it. We don't abandon her now." "But we need a different strategy," Peter Chen said. "We can't maintain this level of defense indefinitely. We need to solve the problem, not just react to it." "How?" Ruth asked. "We make Pike's tactics public. We force him to operate in the light instead of the shadows." Sarah shook her head. "He owns the newspaper. Who's going to publish accusations against him?" "The territorial governor," Peter said. "Pike might control Valentine, but he doesn't control Omaha. We send evidence of his sabotage to the territorial authorities, force an investigation." "What evidence?" Tom asked. "Hutchins' threats? Riders in the night? Pike will just deny everything." "Then we create evidence he can't deny," Ruth said slowly. An idea was forming, dangerous, but possible. "We give him an opportunity to incriminate himself, and we make sure there are witnesses." The plan was risky, possibly suicidal, but it was also their only real option. Ruth sent word to Gerald Hutchins that she wanted to discuss Vernon Pike's offer. She set the meeting for Saturday afternoon at her property, requesting that Pike himself attend to negotiate directly. "He won't come," Tom predicted. "He's too smart to expose himself." But Pike came. He arrived in an expensive carriage with 2 bodyguards, looking every inch the successful businessman. Vernon Pike was in his mid-40s, well-fed and confident, the kind of man who'd never known real hardship. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, climbing down from the carriage, "I'm pleased you've decided to be reasonable." "I have conditions," Ruth said. "Of course you do. Let's hear them." "I want $400, not $200. And I want a guarantee that you won't pursue claims against any of my neighbors." Pike laughed. "$400? For this? The improvements are barely worth the original offer." "The improvements include a complete survival cache, detailed weather records, and construction methods that make winter homesteading viable. That knowledge alone is worth more than $400. Knowledge I can obtain for free once you vacate the property." "Can you?" Ruth pulled out one of Elias's notebooks. "These contain 2 years of careful observation and calculation. They're the only copies. If I sell, they come with the sale. If I don't sell, they disappear." Pike's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing." "Am I? How much is it worth to you to be certain?" They negotiated for 20 minutes, Pike eventually agreeing to $350 and a written statement that he would make no claims against neighboring properties. "I'll have the papers drawn up," Pike said. "You'll sign next week." "I'll sign now," Ruth said, "if you're willing to put your guarantee in writing." Pike hesitated, and in that moment, Ruth knew she had him. "I don't carry legal documents with me," he said. "Then write it out. Simple statement, your signature, witnessed by your men. That's all I need to know you're serious." Pike considered this. Then he pulled out paper and a pen. He wrote quickly, his handwriting cramped and efficient. When he finished, he signed with a flourish and handed the paper to Ruth. She read it carefully. Then she smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Pike. This is exactly what I needed." "The deed transfer papers will be ready Monday. Don't make me come collect you." "Oh, I don't think you'll be coming back," Ruth said. She raised her voice. "You can come out now." Tom Patterson emerged from the barn, Sarah from behind the cabin. James, Peter, Marcus, Daniel, Emma, and 6 other neighbors from various hiding places around the property. Pike's face went white. "What is this?" "This," Ruth said, holding up the paper he'd just signed, "is your confession. You just signed a statement guaranteeing you won't pursue neighboring claims, which means you were planning to pursue those claims, which means you've been actively working to drive homesteaders off their land." "That doesn't prove anything." It proves intent. Combined with witness testimony about your threats, the arson, the poisoned wells, the night riders, it's enough for the territorial governor to launch an investigation. And once they start looking into your land acquisitions, Mr. Pike, what do you think they'll find? Pike's jaw clenched. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who preys on people he thinks are weak, who uses fear and violence to take what isn't his. Ruth stepped closer. But I'm not weak, and I'm not alone, and I'm not afraid of you. You should be. Why? What are you going to do? Burn my tunnel again? I'm rebuilding with sod. Poison my well? We're testing the water daily. Send more riders? We're ready for them. Ruth held up the signed paper. And now I have proof of your intentions. You make one more move against me or anyone in this valley, and this goes to Omaha, along with sworn statements from every person here. Pike looked at the gathered neighbors, at their determined faces, and Ruth saw the moment he realized he'd lost. This isn't over, he said. Yes, Ruth replied. It is. Go back to Omaha, Mr. Pike. Find another valley to exploit. This one's taken. Pike climbed into his carriage and left without another word. The neighbors erupted in cheers and backslapping. Tom was grinning. Sarah was laughing. Even Emma Holloway was smiling. But Ruth just felt tired. She'd won this battle, but she knew men like Vernon Pike didn't forgive and didn't forget. Someday, somehow, he'd try again. Unless she made sure he couldn't. That night, Ruth wrote her most important letter yet. Not to the territorial governor, though she'd send Pike's confession there too. This letter went to the Omaha Herald, the only newspaper in Nebraska that Pike didn't control. She told them everything: the sabotage, the threats, the attempted land grab, and she offered them something no newspaper could resist: a human interest story about a 17-year-old widow using her dead husband's survival methods to build a community and defeat a corrupt land speculator. The story ran 2 weeks later, spread across the front page under the headline, "Widow's Ingenuity Defeats Land Baron's Schemes." Vernon Pike's reputation was destroyed overnight. 3 other families came forward with similar stories of his sabotage. The territorial governor launched a formal investigation. Pike's business partners quietly distanced themselves. Within a month, Vernon Pike was finished in Nebraska. But Ruth wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The sod tunnel was finished 3 weeks before the land inspector arrived, and it was beautiful in its own brutal way. Thick earthen walls that wouldn't burn. A roof so solid you could walk cattle across it. Ruth stood at one end and could see clear through to the barn, 50 feet of protected passage that had cost them 6 weeks of back-breaking labor. "Your husband would be proud," James Holloway said, running his hand along the compressed earth walls. "This is better than what he designed." "It's exactly what he designed," Ruth corrected. "I just had help building it." But that wasn't entirely true. The sod tunnel incorporated improvements Ruth had developed herself: better drainage, reinforced corners, ventilation holes that kept air moving without letting in wind. She was learning to think like Elias, to see problems before they became disasters. The land inspector was a thin man named Robert Caldwell, who arrived on a Thursday with a leather satchel full of paperwork and an expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, not bothering to dismount, "I'm here to assess your claim for continuous cultivation and improvement. I'll need to see evidence of both." "Of course," Ruth gestured toward the fields. "I've been cultivating 40 acres, wheat and corn in rotation. The barn houses 3 milk cows, 12 chickens, and 2 hogs. The tunnel you see connects the structures for safe winter passage. and the cabin has been continuously occupied since my husband's death 8 months ago." Caldwell finally dismounted, pulling out a notebook. "Show me the fields." Ruth walked him through the property, pointing out each improvement. The irrigated vegetable garden using water channeled from the creek. The root cellar, dug according to Elias's specifications. The chicken coop, with its double walls for winter insulation. Every modification documented in her own notebook, dated and detailed. Caldwell wrote everything down without comment. His face revealed nothing. "The well," he said finally. "Show me the well." Ruth led him to the pump. Caldwell operated it several times, examining the water flow and clarity. Then he pulled a small vial from his satchel and took a sample. "Testing for contamination," he explained. "Standard procedure." But Ruth knew it wasn't standard at all. Vernon Pike might be discredited, but he still had friends in territorial government. Friends who might have suggested that Caldwell look extra carefully at Ruth Mercer's claim. "The water's clean," Ruth said. "We test it weekly." "We?" Caldwell looked up sharply. "Who's we?" "Myself and the neighbors who helped build the tunnel." Elias left detailed instructions for water quality testing. "We've been following them." Caldwell's expression shifted slightly. "You have those instructions?" Ruth retrieved Elias's notebooks and handed them over. Caldwell spent the next hour reading, his skepticism gradually transforming into something that looked like grudging respect. "These are remarkable," he said finally. "I've seen homestead records before, but nothing this thorough. Your husband documented everything. He wanted to make sure I could survive if something happened to him." "Well, it worked." Caldwell closed the notebook. "I've seen enough. The claim stands. You've met all requirements for continuous cultivation and improvement." He paused. "More than met them, actually. This property is better maintained than most established farms in the territory." Relief flooded through Ruth so intensely she had to sit down. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank your husband's obsessive record-keeping and your own determination." Caldwell packed his satchel. "One more thing. I'm required to ask if you plan to maintain this claim long-term or if you're interested in selling." Ruth thought about Vernon Pike's offer, about how close she'd come to losing everything. "I'm keeping it." "Good. The territory needs more homesteaders like you." Caldwell mounted his horse. "I'll file my report next week. You should receive official confirmation within a month." He rode away, leaving Ruth standing in front of the cabin that was now, legally and permanently, hers. That night, the neighbors gathered to celebrate. Sarah brought fresh bread. Tom brought whiskey he'd been saving for a special occasion. Emma brought her grandson, the boy Elias's medicine had saved, now healthy and running around with the other children. "To Ruth Mercer," Tom said, raising his glass, "the stubbornest woman in Nebraska." "To Elias Mercer," Ruth corrected, "who made all this possible." They drank, and Ruth felt Elias's absence like a physical ache. He should have been here for this. He should have seen his methods vindicated, his careful planning rewarded. He should have known that his death wasn't meaningless. But he wasn't here, and dwelling on what should have been wouldn't change that. "What's next?" Sarah asked. "Now that the claim's secure, what are you planning?" Ruth had been thinking about that question for weeks. "I want to share Elias's methods properly, not just copying notebooks and handing them to neighbors, but teaching people how to think about survival the way he did." "Like a school?" Emma asked. "Not exactly. More like—" Ruth struggled to find the words. Elias saw patterns in everything. Wind patterns, temperature patterns, patterns in how storms developed and when wells froze, and why some buildings held heat better than others. He taught himself to predict problems before they happened. That's what I want to teach. How to see the patterns. "That's a tall order," Peter Chen said. "Most people can barely manage their own properties, let alone study weather like a science." Maybe. But what if they could? What if every homesteader in the Sandhills knew how to build a winter tunnel? how to test water quality, how to calculate safe exposure times. How many lives would that save? The question hung in the air. Tom broke the silence. You'd need a place to teach, somewhere bigger than this cabin. And teaching materials, James added. Can't just hand people Elias's notebooks. Most of them can't read well enough to understand all those calculations. So we simplify it, Ruth said. Break the complex ideas into simple steps anyone can follow. Build demonstration projects people can see and touch. Where? Sarah asked practically. And with what money? Ruth didn't have answers to those questions. Not yet. But for the first time since Elias died, she felt like she had a purpose beyond simple survival. The answer to the where question came from an unexpected source 2 weeks later. A wagon arrived, carrying a man Ruth had never seen before. He was young, maybe 25, with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands that marked him as someone who knew actual work. "Mrs. Mercer," he called out. "Name's Jonah Bell. I read about you in the Herald, about what you did with Vernon Pike." That was weeks ago. News travels slow out here. I'm from a homestead 30 miles south. Or I was. Lost it last winter when I couldn't prove continuous cultivation. Jonah climbed down from the wagon. "I heard you're teaching Elias Mercer's survival methods. I want to learn." Ruth studied him. He had an honest face, open and direct. "I'm not teaching yet. I'm still figuring out how." "Then let me help you figure it out. I've got nowhere else to be, and I'm tired of watching good people lose their land because they don't know what you know." "You don't know anything about me. I know you beat Vernon Pike. I know you survived a winter that killed your husband. I know you're sharing knowledge instead of hoarding it." Jonah met her eyes. "That's enough." Sarah, who'd been listening from the cabin doorway, spoke up. "We could use another pair of hands. Spring planting's coming, and Ruth can't manage 40 acres alone." "I don't have money to pay hired help," Ruth said. "Don't want pay," Jonah replied. "Want to learn. And maybe help others learn too. Call it an exchange." Ruth hesitated. Letting a stranger onto her property felt risky. But Sarah was right about the spring planting. And if Ruth was serious about teaching Elias's methods, she needed to start somewhere. "All right," she said. "Trial period. 2 weeks. You work the fields and help with the animals. I teach you what Elias taught me. We see if this arrangement makes sense for both of us." Jonah's face broke into a grin. "You won't regret this." Ruth wasn't sure about that, but she was willing to find out. Jonah proved his worth within 3 days. He was a natural farmer, understanding crop rotation and soil quality instinctively. More importantly, he asked intelligent questions about Elias's methods. "Why dig the root cellar at this exact depth?" he asked, examining Elias's diagrams. "Why not deeper for more insulation?" "Because deeper means you hit groundwater," Ruth explained. Elias calculated the frost line and the water table and found the sweet spot between them. Deep enough to stay cool year-round, but shallow enough to stay dry. And the ventilation shaft? Prevents gas buildup from decomposing vegetables. Elias found 3 families who died from toxic gas in poorly ventilated cellars, so he designed this with constant airflow. Jonah wrote everything down in his own notebook, his handwriting surprisingly neat for someone with such rough hands. He thought about everything, didn't he? Everything except how to ask for help when he needed it. That evening, Jonah helped Ruth repair fence line damaged by winter storms. They worked in comfortable silence until Jonah finally said, "Can I ask what happened to him? Elias, I mean? People tell different stories." Ruth had been expecting this question. "He froze to death trying to reach the barn during a blizzard, 50 feet from safety. Because the tunnel wasn't finished. Because he tried to do everything alone. because he thought asking for help was admitting failure. Ruth hammered in a fence post harder than necessary, because he was stubborn and proud and convinced he could outthink any problem if he just calculated hard enough. But his calculations saved your life. They did, and now they're saving other lives. So maybe his stubbornness wasn't entirely wasted. Ruth straightened up, wiping sweat from her forehead. But I won't make his mistake. I'm building something bigger than one person can manage alone. The teaching project. The teaching project, Ruth confirmed, which I still haven't figured out how to fund or organize or— What if you didn't fund it? Jonah interrupted. What if it funded itself? Ruth looked at him. I'm listening. People would pay for this knowledge. Not much, homesteaders don't have much, but a small fee for classes, or a share of their first successful harvest using Mercer methods, enough to cover materials and maybe hire additional teachers eventually. I'm not charging people for knowledge that should be free. It's not about charging for knowledge. It's about making the project sustainable. Your husband left you enough supplies for one winter. How many winters can you keep giving away medicine and seed and materials before you've got nothing left to give? The question was uncomfortably accurate. Ruth had already depleted half of Elias's survival cash, helping neighbors. At this rate, she'd have nothing left by next winter. A small fee, Ruth said slowly. Just enough to maintain supplies and replace what's used. And nobody gets turned away for inability to pay. Fair enough, Jonah grinned. So when do we start? We need a proper building first. Somewhere weatherproof, where people can learn year-round. And demonstration projects, a model tunnel, a test garden, examples of everything we're teaching. I can build, Jonah offered. Grew up helping my father with construction. If you've got materials and a design, I can make it happen. Ruth pulled out Elias's notebooks. I've got better than a design. I've got detailed specifications for every structure he ever planned. They started building the teaching facility the next week. The structure was simple, a one-room building with a sod roof and thick earthen walls, designed to demonstrate the same winter protection principles Ruth had used for the tunnel. Inside, they installed shelves for notebooks and teaching materials, a large table for demonstrations, and the small stove for heat. It's not much, Jonah said, standing back to admire their work. But it's a start. It's perfect, Ruth replied. And it was. Humble, practical, built to last. Exactly what Elias would have designed. The first class was held on a Saturday in late May. Ruth expected maybe 5 people. 15 showed up. They crowded into the teaching facility. Homesteaders and their wives, and even a few children, all eager to learn the methods that had helped Ruth Mercer survive when so many others had failed. Ruth stood at the front of the room, suddenly nervous. She'd never taught anything before. What if she explained it wrong? What if Elias's methods didn't work for other people? What if— Just start, Sarah whispered from the back. They're here because they want to learn. Ruth took a deep breath and began. My husband Elias believed that survival wasn't about being strong or lucky. It was about being prepared. About seeing problems before they became crises. Today, I'm going to teach you how he thought about winter survival, starting with the single most dangerous thing in the sandhills, the space between your cabin and your barn. She walked them through the tunnel construction, explaining each decision Elias had made and why. The depth of the trench, the thickness of the walls, the ventilation considerations. She showed them how to calculate safe exposure times based on temperature and wind speed, how to test building materials for insulation value, how to identify the signs of impending storms. The class lasted 3 hours, and nobody left early. Afterward, a woman named Martha Simmons approached Ruth. "My husband died last winter, same as yours, frozen trying to reach the barn. I didn't understand why until today. Thank you for explaining it." "I'm sorry for your loss," Ruth said. "Don't be sorry. Teach me how to build that tunnel. Teach me how to survive the next winter, so my children don't lose both parents." Ruth taught her, and the next week, Martha brought 3 other widows who'd lost husbands to winter exposure. The week after that, those widows brought their neighbors. By mid-June, Ruth was teaching 2 classes per week to standing room-only crowds. And then the letter arrived. It came from the territorial governor's office, delivered by special courier. Ruth opened it with shaking hands, terrified it was bad news about the Pike investigation, or some new challenge to her land claim. Instead, it was an invitation. The governor wanted Ruth to present Elias's survival methods at the territorial legislature in Omaha, to demonstrate how homesteader mortality rates could be reduced through proper education and preparation, to help shape new policies for supporting settlers in harsh territories. "They want me to speak to the legislature," Ruth said, reading the letter for the 3rd time. "Me, a 17-year-old widow who can barely manage her own property." 18, Sarah corrected. "Your birthday was last month, remember? And you're not barely managing, you're thriving. You beat Vernon Pike, survived the winter, proved your claim, and started a teaching program that's already helping dozens of families. If anyone should speak to the legislature, it's you. I don't know how to talk to politicians. So learn, same as you learned everything else." Sarah took the letter from Ruth's hands. "This is an opportunity, not just for you, but for every homesteader in Nebraska. They're finally paying attention. Don't waste it because you're scared." Ruth knew Sarah was right, but the thought of standing in front of powerful men and explaining Elias's methods made her stomach clench with anxiety. That night, Jonah found her sitting outside the cabin, staring at the stars. "Sarah told me about the letter," he said, sitting down beside her. "Congratulations." "I don't feel congratulated. I feel terrified." "Good. That means you understand what's at stake." Jonah was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something? When I lost my homestead last winter, I thought my life was over. I'd failed at the one thing I'd worked for. I had nothing. Was nothing. Then I read about you in the Herald, and I thought, if this widow can beat Vernon Pike, maybe I'm not as worthless as I feel." Ruth looked at him, surprised by the raw honesty in his voice. "You gave me hope," Jonah continued. "And now the governor's asking you to do the same thing for the whole territory. Yes, it's terrifying. Yes, you might fail. But what if you don't? What if you stand up there and change how the territory thinks about homesteading? What if you save hundreds of lives because you were brave enough to be scared?" "When did you become so wise?" Ruth asked. "About the same time you became so stubborn," Jonah smiled. "Go to Omaha. Speak to the legislature. Show them what Elias taught you. I'll manage things here while you're gone." "You've been here less than a month." "And I already know how to run this place better than most people who've been homesteading for years. That's because of your teaching. Now go teach the people who make the rules." Ruth made her decision that night. She would go to Omaha. She would speak to the legislature. She would make Elias's death mean something. But first, she had one more class to teach. The final session before her departure was the largest yet. Nearly 40 people crowded into the teaching facility and spilling out into the yard. Ruth taught them about water quality testing, showing them how to identify contamination before it made them sick. Halfway through the demonstration, a man in the back raised his hand. "Mrs. Mercer, I heard Vernon Pike tried to poison your well. Is that true?" The room went silent. Ruth hadn't planned to discuss Pike, but these people deserved honesty. "Yes," she said. "Or at least he sent men to try. We caught them before they succeeded." That's why testing water quality isn't just good practice. It's necessary protection. Because there will always be people like Pike who see your success as a threat to their power.
So how do we fight them? The man asked.
The same way you fight winter, with preparation, with knowledge, with community. Ruth looked around the room at all the faces watching her. Pike thought I was weak because I was young and alone. He was wrong about the alone part. I had neighbors who helped me build the tunnel, who stood watch against his riders, who witnessed his threats and helped bring him down. That's how you fight men like Pike. Together. The room erupted in applause. After class, Sarah pulled Ruth aside. "You're ready for Omaha." "How do you know?" "Because you just gave 40 people hope and a plan. That's exactly what the legislature needs to hear." Ruth packed for Omaha the next morning, leaving Jonah in charge of the property and the teaching schedule. As the stagecoach pulled away from Valentine, Ruth looked back at the homestead that had almost killed her and had instead given her a purpose. Elias's tunnel stood solid against the prairie wind. His survival methods lived in the notebooks Ruth carried in her bag. His legacy was growing with every person she taught. "I'm going to make them listen," Ruth whispered. "I promise." The stagecoach rolled toward Omaha, carrying a young widow who'd learned that survival was just the beginning. Omaha was bigger than Ruth had imagined. The streets teemed with people, horses, wagons moving in organized chaos that made her small homestead feel impossibly distant. She clutched Elias's notebooks to her chest, like a shield, as the stagecoach deposited her in front of the territorial building. A clerk met her at the entrance, a young man with spectacles who looked her up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "Mrs. Mercer?" he asked, like he wasn't sure she was real. "That's right." "You're younger than I expected. The governor's assistant will see you now." Ruth followed him through marble hallways that echoed with every footstep. She'd never been inside a government building before. The sheer size of it made her feel small. The governor's assistant was a woman named Margaret Thornton, sharp-eyed and businesslike. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You'll have 15 minutes tomorrow to present to the legislative committee," Margaret said, shuffling papers on her desk. "They're skeptical about dedicating territorial funds to homesteader education. You'll need to convince them this isn't charity. It's investment." "It's not charity," Ruth said. "It's survival." "Then prove it. Bring data. Bring evidence. Bring whatever your husband left you that's worth the legislature's time." Margaret looked up sharply. "And for God's sake, don't cry. They hate when women cry." "I wasn't planning to cry." "Good, because half those men think homesteading is a waste of territorial resources anyway. They'll be looking for any excuse to dismiss you." Ruth felt her stomach drop. "Then why did the governor invite me?" "Because the other half think homesteading is the future of Nebraska. You're caught in a political fight that has nothing to do with you personally. Welcome to government." Margaret softened slightly. "Look, I read the Herald article about you. What you did with Vernon Pike? That took guts. Just bring that same energy tomorrow, and you'll be fine." But Ruth didn't feel fine. She felt terrified. That night, alone in a boarding house room, Ruth spread Elias's notebooks across the bed and tried to organize her thoughts. What would convince skeptical legislators that survival education mattered? She was still awake at midnight when she found it. Tucked into the back of Elias's earliest notebook was a letter she'd never seen before. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakably Elias's. "To the territorial governor, I write to propose a system of homesteader education that could reduce winter mortality by as much as 60%. Through 2 years of careful observation and calculation, I have identified the primary causes of homesteader death in harsh climates: inadequate shelter preparation, insufficient food storage, poor understanding of exposure risks, and, most critically, isolation. The solution is not individual, but collective. If homesteaders shared survival knowledge systematically, rather than learning through trial and fatal error, entire communities could thrive where individuals currently perish. I have developed detailed methods for winter tunnel construction, emergency food preservation, water quality maintenance, and weather prediction. I request territorial support to establish a teaching facility where these methods can be shared freely with all settlers. This is not theoretical. I have tested every method personally.
I stake my life on their effectiveness. Respectfully, Elias Mercer.
The letter was dated October 1867, 3 months before Elias died. Ruth read it again, her hands shaking. Elias had tried to do exactly what she was doing now. He'd reached out to the territorial government, proposing the same teaching facility Ruth had just built. And someone, the governor or an assistant or a clerk, had ignored him. If they'd listened, Elias might still be alive. He could have built his teaching facility with territorial support, instead of trying to do everything alone. He could have had help finishing the tunnel before that fatal storm. The government's indifference had killed him. Ruth felt rage building in her chest, hot and consuming. Tomorrow she would stand in front of the men who'd ignored her husband's plea for help, and she would make them listen. The legislative chamber was intimidating by design.
High ceilings, ornate woodwork,
Rows of stern-faced men who looked like they'd already decided Ruth was wasting their time. Margaret Thornton introduced her with minimal ceremony. Mrs. Ruth Mercer, presenting on homesteader survival education. Ruth walked to the front of the chamber, placed Elias's notebooks on the podium, and looked at the assembled legislators. Her heart was hammering, but her voice came out steady. "Gentlemen, my husband wrote to this government 2 years ago requesting support for a homesteader education program. You ignored him. 3 months later, he froze to death 50 feet from his own barn." The room went absolutely silent. "I'm not here to blame you for his death," Ruth continued. "I'm here to make sure his death, and the deaths of hundreds of other homesteaders like him, actually means something." One of the legislators, an older man with white whiskers, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mercer, we're very sorry for your loss, but individual tragedies don't constitute grounds for territorial policy. 63 homesteaders died in Cherry County alone last winter," Ruth interrupted. "That's not individual tragedy. That's systemic failure. And every single one of those deaths was preventable." She opened Elias's notebook to the page with survival calculations. "My husband measured everything: temperature, wind speed, exposure times, heat loss rates. He proved that a person has approximately 4 minutes in a blizzard before their fingers stop working, 5 minutes before confusion sets in, 7 minutes before they can't find their way back to shelter, even if it's right in front of them." Ruth looked up at the legislators. "The average distance between a cabin and barn in the Sandhills is 50 feet. In calm weather, that's a 12-second walk. In a blizzard, it becomes a death sentence. But it doesn't have to be." She explained the tunnel design, the sod construction, the community building process. She showed them Elias's water quality tests and how they'd prevented contamination. She detailed the medicine cache that had saved James Holloway's grandson. "I've been teaching these methods for 2 months," Ruth said. 43 families have attended my classes. 12 have already built winter tunnels. 3 have implemented water testing protocols. And not one of them will die the way my husband did, alone in the snow, because they didn't know there was a better way. The white-whiskered legislator leaned forward. "This is all very impressive, Mrs. Mercer. But what exactly are you asking from this body?" "Funding for 10 teaching facilities across Nebraska. trained instructors at each location, standardized materials based on proven methods, and most importantly, free access for any homesteader who needs it. Ruth pulled out the letter Elias had written.
My husband proposed the same program 2 years ago. If you'd listened to him then, he'd be standing here instead of me. How many more people need to die before you listen now? The chamber erupted in argument. Some legislators were moved by her testimony. Others dismissed it as emotional manipulation. The debate raged for 20 minutes while Ruth stood silently, watching them argue about whether her husband's life had value. Finally, the committee chairman banged his gavel. We'll take this under advisement. Mrs. Mercer, you'll have our decision within 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Ruth repeated. How many homesteaders will die in 2 weeks while you deliberate? The chairman's face hardened. That's not a fair question. It's the only question that matters. Ruth gathered Elias's notebooks and walked out of the chamber, her hands shaking with suppressed fury. Margaret Thornton caught up with her in the hallway. That was either brilliant or catastrophic. I can't tell which yet. I don't care, Ruth said. I told them the truth. If they choose to ignore it again, that's on them. You made enemies in there, powerful ones. I already had powerful enemies. At least these ones can't burn down my tunnel. Margaret laughed despite herself. Fair point. Where will you stay while you wait for their decision? I'm not waiting. I'm going home. They know where to find me. The journey back to Valentine took 3 days, and Ruth spent every mile second-guessing herself. Had she been too aggressive? Too emotional? Had she destroyed any chance of getting territorial support by confronting the legislators about Elias's ignored letter? But when the stagecoach finally pulled into Valentine, Ruth saw something that made all her doubts evaporate. The teaching facility had been expanded. The small one-room building she'd left was now twice as large, with a new addition built in the same sod construction style. A hand-painted sign hung over the door. Mercer Institute of Homestead Survival. Jonah was waiting in the yard, grinning like he pulled off the greatest surprise in history. What did you do? Ruth asked, climbing down from the stagecoach. What you told me to do. Manage things while you were gone. Jonah gestured at the expansion. 40 people showed up for classes the week after you left. We couldn't fit them all in the old building, so we built a bigger one. Tom Patterson organized the construction. Sarah Patterson designed the layout. Peter Chen donated materials. Everyone contributed. Ruth walked slowly toward the building, hardly believing what she was seeing. How did you pay for all this? We didn't. Not with money, anyway. Jonah followed her inside. The new space had proper benches for students, a large demonstration area, shelves filled with copied notebooks and teaching materials. Every family that attended classes contributed labor or materials, or both. Some brought food to feed the workers. Others brought tools. Marcus Webb's wife made all those notebooks by hand, copying Elias's methods so everyone could have their own reference guide. Ruth's throat tightened. I was only gone 2 weeks. 2 weeks is a long time when people are motivated. And Ruth, they're motivated. You showed them survival is possible. They want to learn everything you know. The teaching schedule had grown from 2 classes per week to 6. Jonah had been handling the basic sessions himself, teaching tunnel construction and water testing from the notes Ruth had left him. More advanced topics waited for Ruth's return. You did all this? Ruth asked. I followed your example. You taught me that survival isn't about individual effort. It's about community. So I built community. Jonah's expression turned serious. How did it go in Omaha? Ruth told him about the legislative testimony, about finding Elias's ignored letter, about the committee's non-committal response. They might say no, she finished. They might decide homesteader education isn't worth territorial funding. Then we do it anyway, Jonah said simply. This facility exists. The methods work. People are learning. Whether the territorial government helps or not doesn't change any of that. He was right. Ruth had been so focused on getting official support that she'd lost sight of what actually mattered. The teaching was already happening. Lives were already being saved. The government's approval would be helpful, but it wasn't necessary. "When did you get so wise?" Ruth asked for the second time. "About the same time you stopped waiting for permission to do what needed to be done," Jonah smiled. "Speaking of which, there's one more surprise." He led her outside to where a group of people had gathered. Not just neighbors, but homesteaders from all over Cherry County. Ruth recognized some faces from her classes. Others were strangers. Sarah Patterson stepped forward. "We heard you were coming back today. We wanted to be here when you arrived." "Why?" Ruth asked. "Because you changed everything," James Holloway said. "My grandson is alive because you shared Elias's medicine. My family will survive next winter because you taught us the tunnel design. You didn't have to do any of that. You could have sold to Vernon Pike and left. But you stayed. You fought. You taught us that we're stronger together than we ever were alone." Emma Holloway held up a document. "We took a vote. All 43 families who've attended your classes. We want to make this official. The Mercer Institute isn't just yours anymore. It belongs to all of us. We're forming a cooperative. Everyone who learns contributes to teaching the next group. Everyone who benefits helps maintain the facilities. No one gets left behind." Ruth took the document with shaking hands. It was a formal agreement, signed by every family that had attended her classes. A commitment to keeping Elias's methods alive and growing. "I don't know what to say," Ruth whispered. "Say you'll keep teaching," Martha Simmons said. "Say you'll help us build more facilities in other counties. Say you'll make sure Elias Mercer's name means survival instead of tragedy." "I'll keep teaching," Ruth said. "I promise." The celebration that night was louder and longer than any Ruth had experienced. People brought food, music, stories of how Elias's methods had already saved them from small disasters. Tom Patterson got drunk and gave a rambling speech about stubborn widows and the power of good planning. Sarah made everyone laugh with stories of Ruth's first attempts at sod construction. Jonah stayed by Ruth's side through all of it, quiet and steady and somehow essential. When the celebration finally wound down and the last neighbors headed home, Ruth and Jonah sat on the cabin steps, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I have to tell you something," Jonah said. Ruth's stomach tightened. "That sounds ominous." "It's not ominous, it's just, I came here to learn survival methods, to figure out how not to lose another homestead. But somewhere along the way, this became about more than just survival." "What did it become about?" Jonah turned to face her. "You. This place. Building something that matters. I don't want to just pass through anymore, Ruth. I want to stay. Really stay. Not as a student or hired help, but as—" He stopped, searching for words. Ruth's heart was pounding. "As what?" "As someone who cares about you, who sees what you're building and wants to help build it with you. Who thinks you're the strongest, stubbornest, most remarkable person he's ever met." Jonah took a breath. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving Elias. I know I have no right to—" "Jonah," Ruth interrupted. "Stop talking." He stopped. Ruth thought about Elias's letter, the one where he'd told her not to feel guilty if she found someone who made her happy. She thought about the months of hard work, of learning to survive, of building something bigger than herself. She thought about Jonah's steady presence, his willingness to help without demanding control, his respect for what she was creating. "You're right that it's too soon," Ruth said carefully. "I'm 18 years old. I've been widowed less than a year. I'm still figuring out who I am without Elias."
Jonah nodded, disappointment flickering across his face.
But, Ruth continued, I'm not saying no. I'm saying not yet. I'm saying, let's keep building this institute together. Let's keep teaching.
Let's see where we are in 6 months or a year. And if you're still here, still helping, still thinking I'm remarkable despite all my stubbornness, then we'll have this conversation again. Jonah's smile was like sunrise. I can wait. I'm good at waiting. You're good at a lot of things, Ruth said. That's why I want you to stay. The territorial government's response arrived 3 weeks later. The committee had approved funding for 5 teaching facilities across Nebraska, with the Mercer Institute designated as the primary training center. They'd allocated money for materials, instructor salaries, and standardized curriculum development. And they'd credited Elias Mercer posthumously as the program's founder. Margaret Thornton's accompanying letter was brief. You terrified them into doing the right thing. Well done. Ruth read the letter to the assembled cooperative at their weekly meeting. The cheers were deafening. 5 facilities, Tom said, still processing. That means we need trained instructors at each location. People who understand Elias's methods well enough to teach them accurately. We have people, Sarah said. Ruth trained us. We can train others. That's how this works. And that's exactly what happened. Over the next year, the Mercer Institute grew from 1 building to a full campus. They added a demonstration farm showing proper crop rotation, a model homestead with every survival feature Elias had designed, a library containing copies of his notebooks and additional research from other successful homesteaders. The 5 territorial facilities became 10, then 15. Mortality rates among homesteaders dropped 40% in the first year alone. Ruth taught constantly, traveling between facilities, training instructors, refining methods. Jonah managed the main campus, handling the endless logistics of a growing operation. Together, they turned Elias's obsessive calculations into a systematic approach to survival that saved hundreds of lives. The reporters came eventually, wanting to write about the young widow who'd built an empire of survival education. Ruth refused most interviews, but she did agree to one, with the Omaha Herald. The reporter asked the obvious question. Do you think your husband would be proud of what you've accomplished? Ruth thought about Elias, about his notebooks filled with careful observations, about his survival cache hidden beneath the cabin floor, about his letter telling her to live, really live, not just survive. I think he'd be relieved, Ruth said finally. He spent 2 years trying to solve problems alone. I've spent the last year proving that solutions come from community, not isolation. That's what he was learning before he died. That asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. The article ran with the headline, From Winter's Grave to Survival's Legacy, How Ruth Mercer Transformed Tragedy into Hope. Vernon Pike read it in a prison cell in Omaha, serving time for fraud and land manipulation. Ruth never thought about him anymore. He'd been a symptom of a larger problem, people preying on the vulnerable. And the Mercer Institute was part of the cure. 2 years after Elias's death, on a clear spring morning, Ruth and Jonah were married in the teaching facility, surrounded by the entire cooperative. Sarah and Tom stood as witnesses. Emma Holloway's grandson, now healthy and loud and 8 years old, carried the rings. Your husband was a good man, the minister said during the ceremony. His legacy lives on through the work you both do. His legacy lives on through everyone who learns his methods, Ruth corrected. Through every tunnel built, every storm survived, every family that makes it through winter because someone taught them how. That's Elias's real legacy. Not me, not this institute. The knowledge that keeps spreading, person to person, generation to generation. That night, Ruth went to Elias's grave for the first time since the funeral. The simple marker read, Elias Mercer, 1842 to 1868. He measured the wind so others could shelter from it. I finished what you started, Ruth said aloud. The tunnel, the teaching, the community you were trying to build. It's all real now, all working. You were right about everything except one thing. You didn't have to do it alone. I wish you'd known that before it was too late. She placed a copy of the Mercer Institute curriculum on the grave, the compiled and refined version of all his notebooks. They're calling your methods the foundation of modern homesteading. Students come from 3 territories to learn them. The government's making your approach official policy for all federal homestead programs. You changed everything, Elias. I just made sure people knew it. Jonah waited at the edge of the graveyard, giving Ruth privacy but staying close enough that she wasn't alone. Ruth touched the gravestone one last time. Thank you for leaving me more than just survival supplies. Thank you for leaving me a purpose. She walked back to Jonah, who took her hand without speaking. Together they returned to the Institute, where tomorrow's classes were already planned and next month's expansion was being designed, and the future was being built, one careful calculation at a time. The Nebraska winds still blew cold and hard across the sandhills, but now hundreds of families knew how to build tunnels that turned 50 feet of danger into 50 feet of safety. They knew how to test water, preserve food, read storm patterns, and most importantly, how to help each other survive. Elias Mercer had died trying to protect one person. Ruth Mercer had lived to protect thousands. And in doing so, she'd proven that the greatest survival tool wasn't a tunnel or a cache or a calculation. It was the simple, revolutionary act of refusing to face the storm alone.